Hello, good morning. It's Thursday, November 7th, and I am Rob, that developer dad, and we're building .NET applications. Today, I'm going to continue the work of getting the customer and subscription data migrated out of my SQL database and into an Azure Table storage structure. To do that, I've had to add some functionality to my Microsoft Graph Provider component, as well as think about standing up a new class to actually build these customer objects that I'm going to need. So we're going to do that in the context of a console application. So let me share my screen. And here's the beginning of that console app. I've got my users. The only things that I need out of Graph for this are the user ID and their display name. Oh, excuse me, goodness. And then I need to create down here in local services inside the console app. Add a new class, and I'm just going to call it a user account builder. There we go. And it can actually stay internal because it's going to live inside whatever manager is ultimately going to be using this. I'm thinking I'll eventually pull this into the AccountManager component over in the admin app, but for migration purposes, I'm going to need it here. So let's go ahead and create another class called a user account. And this can be internal as well. This guy's going to need some properties. So let's take a look at what's on this user resource up in the metered usage access resource models. We're going to have a couple more subclasses. So why don't we add those to the user account right now? I don't need the dependency builder or any of this stuff yet. User access, app user, user account builder, here we go. It's going to have a prop, string, user ID, and we'll initialize that to an empty string. Oh, wait. I don't use that type of thing. I just use the implicit assignment operator. And then I need the display name. I'm also going to need a user ID resource. And for that, I'm just going to go ahead and copy these properties. Over into here. And user vendor ID. paste. Holds a user's ID at an identified external vendor for the identified external vendors systems. And this is just how I'm going to correlate the users that we set up here in Microsoft Entra with the account that they would have in with the e-commerce service that I'll be setting up, as well as any other third-party systems that I need to integrate with later. So public list, I'm just going to use list of user vendor ID. External IDs, get set equals new list of user vendor ID. Good, we got the terminator there. And we need a public user subscription nullable as subscription. Now, user subscription is not a good name for this because I don't want to use the resource access type for this. So let's just go ahead and add a new class, subscription. And for those of you who know how I do things, you already understand why I'm setting up discrete models for each layer in the each major component in the call stack. For those of you who don't, it means I can have local definitions of these conceptual objects, and they can vary according to the needs of the local code. And the only time that it really matters in terms of having to change these published versions of things is when the public surface of the class or service changes in some way that requires that the upstream components also change. So here on user subscription, you know what? I'm just going to copy, paste, and modify. So subscription ID doesn't really matter. And I'm going to copy this guy and drop those properties into here. Now ID, I've had that because, well, I was using a relational data store, and I am no longer using a relational data store. Equals string dot empty. Go. renew, all of this stuff. Save that. And then we need to have a place to hold the quotas. So add a class entitlements and we don't really need to attach this to the user ID anymore. The display name, no. What the heck? Oh, that's just being silly. Copilot's being goofy. Now up here in the resource access, we've got this user quota. And we've got a couple of resource quotas down here. And some methods. And we expose those quotas. So, before I flesh the entitlements out, add another class called quota. And now up in resource quota, we're using an enum. And metered resource kind is in the game tools framework. Good. Now that means down here, I need to add a reference to the metered resource or to the game tools framework project. Here we go. Because that's a common concept throughout the system. So internal class quota. And let's take a look at what resource quota looks like. So we're going all the way out to the ultimate leaf of our complex object hierarchy. Get the details of this guy. So quota ID. I don't even need that because we're not dealing with relational data anymore. But it is used throughout the interfaces, so I don't want to break that too much. And let's just grab these properties because it's got to be, or it's going to be the same or similar for the time being. It may drift. It will probably drift. And excuse me. I don't want to have to make massive changes when it does drift. CTOR. Here we go. Now, that's really about all I need. So, that's resource quota. You can go bye-bye. User quota. And what we could do here is we can say quota ID equals 1. And because this isn't a real primary key value here, I could just hard code those ID values. And then when we add more kinds of resource quotas, I'll just hard code those values. Now, does, so storage, this is in the user quota. Oh, not what I wanted to do there. Don't save that. I need to do this in the entitlements. Duh. But what I do want is we'll go ahead and grab the user ID. Get quota. We're going to go ahead and grab all of these properties and drop them into the entitlements class. I'm going to change resource quota to just quota. And we're going to change resource quota to quota. And then quota. And we've got user ID. What else do we have in here? We've got our constructor. String.empty, user ID, and then I need to set the set those. Quota ID equals 1. And then metered resource equals NPC storage. Pull this fully qualified namespace nonsense out and add that as a using. Boop. If you don't make the sound effects, it doesn't always work. The sound effects the sound effects scare the bugs away. Metered resource equals NPC AI detail. Beautiful. And I want to change the name of that property. Rename. Up at the top. NPC AI generation. There. I think that's all we need there. So let's save it again. Entitlements, good. Let's pop out to subscription and we'll go public entitlements. User quotas. Get, set, save. And we'll make that nullable. I believe that's about all we need. And then, of course, we've got user account down here. Good. Excuse me. So, down here, and which project do I have referenced? I've got Game Tools Framework, User Access, and the MS Graph Provider, Metered Usage Access, the Azure Tables Provider, and the SQL Server Provider for usage access. Good. have I defined a load user account or load user resource on that contract? So here's iQuota access. All right. And then UserSubscription access. Start subscription, load subscription, renew subscription, cancel subscription. That doesn't really help me out all that much, does it? Well, I think I am going to need to define a new interface on metered usage access. Not in love with this. Really not in love with this because I've just poked a big fat hole in my, well, no, I haven't. Never mind. Never mind. I am going to cheat. No, I'm not. No, I am going to cheat. I'm going to cheat like a son of a gun. All right, so I've got user subscription access SQL provider here, right? And is it at all implemented? It sure is. Load subscription, user ID, beautiful. Got the quotas. We're attaching those. Is this just load quotas? No, this is load subscription. Okay, good. Okay, blah, 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 blah. Okay, so I can actually use this user subscription SQL provider because it's going to pull everything I need to get that subscription information. So here's iQuota access. I don't really need that yet. Subscription, fine. User account, fine. And program CS. All right, not too concerned yet. So where is my user account builder? Right here. I'm gonna need well, let's go ahead and create a constructor. I am going to need, let's sketch out public async task of user account and make it nullable. Build user account. And it's going to take in an app user object. User identity. And in fact, instead of build user account, this is going to be called I'm just going to call it that. So, var, not var, user account. We'll go ahead and make it nullable. And then fall into my Apple keyboard on a Windows remote session keyboard combination nonsense. I'll return the account. Try. Catch. Exception. Yep, I don't have to do any of that fancy crap that I'm doing with op result yet. Should I wrap this in an op result? Thinking, nah. Okay, first thing we can do is assign the attributes that we've, received from the caller. And we know that app user is coming from the user access component. No. String user ID. And I am going to need private read-only user access and no underscore on parameter names, Rob. All right. Fetch the information that we can. Fetch the user's identity information from user access. And I feel like I should rename that to identity access. That feels better to me, but I don't want to start renaming entire assemblies because boy howdy does that simple operation screw up some build pipelines. All right, fetch the user's identity information from user access. So var identity user identity equals user access dot, well, I don't want load app users. I just need load app user. So we're going to have to add a method to iUserAccess. Easy enough. Go to definition and It's just going to be a task of app user, make it nullable, load app user, async, string, user ID. Cool, cool? Cool. Now I got to come into my MS Graph Provider, and we have to update this a little bit. It's okay. We'll get you. Let's roll down. Here's load app users. And I feel like that should be a little different, but fine. Public async task of app user, load app user, async string user ID, and app user equals null, return user, and I do need to make this nullable. And we're going to do a try. Well, no, we're not. Because I'm not actually going to do any logging or anything useful in here. I'm just going to let the exceptions fall out in this case. And I really ought to tighten this stuff up before I go production, but it's honestly, it's kind of hair splitting at this point. Do I have a logger? I do. You know what? No. Okay. So I need a var token equals await get token async if token is null. I'm not sure why I'm getting that token. That feels like an extraneous call that I don't need. Is that token actually used anywhere? Let's take a look here in the load user permission groups. So we've got get token async. Yeah. Graph service client, secret cred, URL, and that's it. Where does the secret cred get built? Okay. All right. So I'm not using a token flow on this, I don't think. We're going to experiment. So down here, instead of doing this get token nonsense, because it doesn't appear to be getting used anywhere, let's just comment that out. Using var client equals and graph service client equals new. So instead of var, I'm going to go graph service client equals and let me just grab these three bloody lines here. C paste, do that, realign you back to where you were, and var graph user equals client. Nope, stop. Ugh. Oh, wait. Instead of proxy, I want to call that client. Dot users user ID and I like to have at most one dot per line dot get async. Now up in here I'm doing some I was doing some request configuration stuff, and I don't actually need to be doing that because I don't need the email that's attached to the identities. My system doesn't really care about that user email yet, or if at all, because my system isn't going to be sending any emails directly. And if graph user dot is not equal to null, we map the user that comes back from Microsoft Graph to our app user. App user. And as a matter of fact, let's use my new favorite pattern. Well, it's not really my new favorite pattern, but this is a really nice way of calling a constructor when we know the type. You can't do this with var. User ID equals graph user.id and display name equals graph user.display name or empty. It's not a null reference assignment. I've already done my null check. Bite me. And user ID. Screw it. Let's just do it that way. So we're fetching it from the graph, mapping it over to our local app user idiom, and then ultimately returning it. Good. That's all we need to do here. So I can get out of here. We'll go back into the user account builder. And user access dot load, and this must be an await load app user async with my user ID. Bonk. And if user identity equals null, was not found in the identity store. There we go. Otherwise, we're going to keep building. Account equals new with user ID equals user identity dot user ID. And prematurely line fed display name. Oh, I need the comma. Derp display name equals user identity dot display name, and that's all we're getting back from the app user. Next, we don't need the user's permission groups. See if the user has a subscription in the subscription store. And that means I need a subscription store. Private, read only, nope. What's it called? What are you called? User subscription access. Sub access. Subscription store is just sort of in this case, the word store is a it's really overloaded term. I'm going to use a service to act as like the shop. The store is where I store the objects. So like when you're deep into software development, you'll hear things talked about like the user store, the data store, the this store, the that store, and it's usually referring to some sort of hardened physical medium where the information about the things that your application acts on are stored. And that's why in the static design for the administrative application, I stopped using the term store to refer to my e-commerce service or the e-commerce service that I'll be contracting with, and started referring to any component that interacts with that service as the shop provider. Because I wanted to disambiguate and on-overload the word store within the context of that application. So user ID, I do not have the user subscription access referenced yet, but I do now. Boop. And I'm going to need to pass that in. And I need the user subscription access, sub access, and that needs a comma. Otherwise, the poor little compiler will get confused. And there's sub access. So I guess what I should do before I go much further here, because the rule of thumb is you code a little and you test a little. Now, I did a lot of testing on this actual iUser access component yesterday, but I want to make sure I can actually build and run this user account builder like one step at a time. So I need here's my config, and static user subscription access get sub access SQL provider. I configuration, config. Now, there's our user subscription access. This is the SQL Server dependency builder. Do I have a method for this? I sure do. And what I am going to do temporarily. Now, I'm going to grab all of this stuff. Copy. I'm going to paste it in here, and we're going to get rid of all of the goop. Config. Change this to config. And the required connection string, I believe, bear with me for just a second. Is SQL connection string. Var SQL settings equals config.get section SQL, and bear with me for just another moment because I'm having to look at some sensitive data. Okay, it's just connection string. Come back to the share. And it's going to be SQL settings. And instead of the parentheses, we got to use a square bracket. And that should give me what I need. Now, down here, I'm not dealing with dependency injection or service collection or any kind of crap like that. My logger factory is going to be null. User subscription access SQL provider. Add a reference. Bonk equals null. My user subscription access SVC equals a new one of those, passing my connection string. And then I can say goodbye to those lines of code. Whoops. Cool. And I have to alias my using statement up top because I've got dependency builders scattered around all over the place. So I can, what I did up there at the top just now, way up here, is I've assigned this this namespace an assembly, or an alias rather, I should say. And now because I just changed the case on graph, I need to fix that down here. And I need to go graph dot, and I gotta do the same thing here. Graph dot. Okay. And that returns my service and var user SQL equals get subaccess SQL provider, pass the config, and then we load our app users async for that group for each of our user in users. Var user account equals await can't set that up yet. User account builder equals new and I need to provide it with my graph client and I need to provide it with my user SQL provider. And because I like things nice and tidy, doesn't look tidy yet, but it will in a second. There we go. That looks a little better. Nice and easy to read. Now I can say await builder dot build user account with user dot user ID. If user account is not null, string sub description equals user account dot subscription equals null. Has a subscription doesn't have a subscription. And this is just some like test stuff so that I can see what's going on. Gah. And we print out the subdescription. And this is going to say it doesn't have a subscription right now because I'm not doing anything with that sub builder, right? But I do want to step through and test and see that all of this stuff is behaving itself. Now I'm going to delete all of my existing breakpoints. And let's just do this. So we'll run. Sometimes if you sing to the compiler, it goes faster. Not really. All right, so I've got my user counter. My user account is currently null. I have my builder. Cool. And we're going to step into build user account. So right now, user account is null. User identity, we're going to go pull that out of the graph. User identity is not null. Happy day. And we're going to create ourselves a new account. And the display name is DevDad. The user ID is there. My external IDs and my subscription don't exist yet. But that's okay. We're going to return the account. And let's just hit run. It's going to come back up there. We're going to run it again, and we're going to run it again. And we'll take a look at our console output. DevDad doesn't have a subscription. I don't have a subscription. I don't have a subscription because I haven't queried for those yet. Cool, cool. Now, there's something I need to do up here in User Account Builder where when it comes in to build this user account, yes, I'm assigning the, excuse me, I'm assigning this stuff, but there's another thing I can assign here before I even get into setting up the subscription stuff. And user access, I need to go into iUser access. And add a property identity vendor and make it read only. So here's my identity vendor. I've got to come into user access graph provider and implement, because this guy does that. I'm surprised that this didn't complain at me. But because we know this is built against MS Graph, public string identity vendor, and I'm not going to call it Microsoft Graph. I'm going to call it MS Entra. Because that's the new name for Microsoft Active Directory, or Azure Active Directory, I should say. So here's our user access graph provider. I've just implemented my missing thing. And account dot IDs dot add give that a semicolon, new user vendor ID, user vendor ID equals user ID Yep. And it's not vendor ID. Come on, doofus. What's the property called? I love having a brain like a sieve. User ID at vendor. Public. There we go. And vendor name equals user access dot identity vendor. Yep, good. Okay, so we've also just populated the information that we got from Microsoft Graph into one of the external ID records. Now, what is the name of the class that I'm getting from the resource access? It's going to be a user subscription. Subresource equals null. Var sub result equals subaccess dot, do I have? I have load subscription for my user ID. And that's going to give me an op result. Yep, sure is. If sub result dot and that needs an await. Otherwise, I'm just getting a task. Dot was successful. Sub resource equals sub result dot payload. Very good. And now I need to convert that sub result into a subscription object. And that's going to be some really messy ass code. Really messy. And because that code is going to be more than meets the eye, I'm going to hide that in a transformer. Class model extensions internal static public static subscription to subdto this user subscription resource. Subscription question mark DTO equals null. Return DTO if resource is not null. And I gotta spell stuff right. I gotta make that guy nullable. DTO equals new. And I'm not gonna do the inline initializer. I'm gonna do explicit property mapping. So DTO dot user id equals resource dot user id DTO dot will renew equals resource dot will renew DTO dot start date UTC end date UTC DTO dot what other properties am I concerned about? I am not. User quotas. User ID equals resource dot user ID. Let's make sure that user quotas is getting instantiated with the subscription. And it is not. So we got to fix that. Do we? Yeah, we do. There we go. And then, of course, inside entitlements, we're creating these values, and we're not actually assigning any budget or consumption yet. So that's fine. Now, user account builder. User ID. Now, because I'm creating that entitlements object right here in the constructor for subscription, I think I can get rid of this nullable signal on there. And that should fix that. Good. Now I can go DTO dot user quotas dot storage equals resource dot quotas dot storage dot budget DTO dot user quotas storage dot consumption equals res quota storage consumption, boop, DTO dot user quotas dot NPC AI generation dot budget equals resource dot quotas dot AI generations dot budget. And this particular model mapper is gonna be probably thrown away. Dot consumption. We'll let Copilot guess at the rest of the stuff. And I think that's about all I need. Now, I was thinking at some point yesterday or the day before that the subscription really needs, well, no, not even the subscription, but the user account. And I need to make this change up at the resource access level as well. So the user resource so we've got the IDs, we've got the current subscription activity, yeah. We also need a public string subscription status. Get set. Subscription status equals none. That's going to be our default value. And I don't like those magic strings. No, sir. Not a fan. But we'll figure it out. Now, I think, well, I also need to add that subscription status over here on my user account. Public string. What did I call it? Golly. You'd think I liked to consume the lettuce a lot. And I don't like that kind of lettuce. Like I'll like a nice iceberg or a romaine or some endive or some red leaf, but the silly thirsty lettuce I'm not a big fan of. I don't use it ever because it doesn't make me feel good. But my God, I get the forgetfuls, something awful. And I'm just going to set a default value on that to none. Okay. So this is really exciting. I'm just mapping properties back and forth between data I know about to this new user account concept that I need to build up so that I can stuff it in a table and then eventually get rid of my SQL Server account altogether. And believe you me, I've seen this thing just running from code against Azure Tables instead of the SQL database. And when you take the SQL going to sleep and having to wake up out of the equation, Um, I haven't measured these operations with like timers or stopwatches or anything like that, but it feels like it's about the same amount of time between using SQL database and table storage. And like I said, I'm not using any of the relational capabilities that SQL gives me. I don't feel like I need them yet. And when I do, I'll probably jury rig something using Azure Tables, and like I'll set up reference indices and so on to create relationships between different NPCs that a user might create, yada yada yada. And um, I'm thinking about those things sort of in the back of my head whenever I'm not thinking about something else. But I think I'm going to be fine with table storage for a good while, at least until it makes sense financially to move back to a SQL Server. Or I might go to a Mongo or a Mariah, maybe Postgres or MySQL, whatever. If I need to go back to a relational data store, I can. That's easy. I've been dealing with relational databases for decades. And getting to use something that's closer to a NoSQL paradigm, such as Azure Table Storage, is actually a lot of fun and rewarding for me because it's not something I've gotten to do in my professional life. So yeah, the learning experience is fantastic. The performance difference is not something that I perceive. We'll see what happens under load. And when we start to accumulate a lot of data, I might have to rethink that statement. But according to the conversations I've had with Microsoft's AI, the performance differences between Azure Tables and Azure SQL for common CRUD ops are negligible, according to the AI that they built. So we'll see. Fullness is waiting, and of course, I'm going to add some metrics and crap like that over time, and we'll see. We'll see if we can actually gather some real data. So for now, I'm going to take a break for a little while, and I intend to be back around 1 p.m. and we'll pick this back up. I might do a little bit more code work, just like the boring mapping crap and stuff like that between now and then. But if I get to something interesting, I'll stop and I'll wait until my next session. So until then, take care of yourselves. Happy coding.